discuss about Lev Vygotsky's theory on language development. Humans, especially children, have an amazing capability to learn language, and it plays a central part in learning. Vygotsky believed language development does not have stages as proposed by Piaget, but children develop these abilities through social interaction. Within the first year of life, children will have learned many of the necessary concepts to have functional language, although it will still take years for their capabilities to develop fully. Multiple theories have been proposed to explain the development of language, and Vygotsky has gained a unique and important place in explaining language development. Who is Vygotsky? Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist whose pioneering work focused on child's development and the connections between language development, social learning, and cognition. Lev Vygotsky was only 38 when he died of tuberculosis, but during his brief life, he produced over many books and articles and has become one of the influential psychologists of the 20th century. Vygotsky began studying learning and development to improve his own teaching. He went on to write about language and thought, the psychology of art, and his work was banned in Russia for many years because he referenced Western psychologists. Vygotsky analyzes the way in which language acquisition shapes a child's growing cognitive abilities. Views on language learning by other familiar psychologists. Skinner states children learn language through operant conditioning. That is, the children receive rewards for using language in a functional manner. Jean Piaget's theory of language development suggests that children use both assimilation and accommodation. Noam Chomsky believed that children have the innate biological abilities to learn language. In this context, we will now focus on Lev Vygotsky's theory on language development, which emphasizes on social learning and zone of proximal development. Let us look into Vygotsky's philosophy on language learning. Vygotsky's socio-cultural approach to language development stresses the fundamental role of community in the process of making sense to language learning. He said, language develops from social interaction, and it is man's greatest tool, a means for communicating with the outside world. He argued that learning is a necessity, and the universal aspect of the process of developing cognition is culturally organized, specifically in human psychological function. In other words, social learning tends to stimulate and precede development. As human race are social, the need to interact, value, starts shaped from social observation of the child. The child wants to move as he observes parents' movement, and also wants to speak as her parents communicate with each other and also with her. It is this natural drive which propels the individual to learn, and language learning is no exception. He further insisted that even higher mental processes which involves greater application of mind in the individual have their origins in social process. Language and thought process. For Vygotsky, thought and language are initially separate systems from the beginning of life, merging at around 3 years of age. For example, sucking, crying, grabbing, curiosity to know, etc. are all thoughts which doesn't have the verbal form initially, and such ideas are biological and innate. As a young child takes the first step towards concept formation, when he puts together a number of objects in unorganized congeries grouped together in brain, inherently unrelated objects linked by chance in the child's perception. This happens even as the child crawls and starts to walk, resulting in increased social interaction and thereby exposure to new and multiple vocabularies. But the child understanding is vague, conglomeration of individuals' objects as images in his mind. That is, The child doesn't know what is the meaning of the word which he hears, but he just observes the sound and matches it with the associated behavior of people within their zone. By the end of 18 to 24 months, the child's language skills will be exposed to multiple words, and the type of words refers to concrete objects in the child's habitual surrounding. Close to 36 months, constant interaction between the child and the adult, that is MKO, develops to construct new meaning as well as identity and fixed meaning of all the different words the child gets exposed to, and thoughts become verbal and speech becomes representational. When this happens, children's monologue internalized to become inner speech as the child grows into adulthood. The internalization of language is important as it drives cognitive development. In other words, inner speech develops gradually from external stimuli by a process of internalization. And at this stage, inner speech and spoken language becomes independent. In this way, the thought process gets refined and the speed of learning a language is greatly influenced by the quality of interaction being exposed to the child. Vygotsky claims cognitive development is a result of internalization. Like Jean Piaget, Vygotsky claimed that infants are born with the basic materials or abilities for intellectual development. Piaget focuses on motor reflexes and sensory abilities, while Vygotsky proposes 4 elementary mental functions. The first one is attention, the next one is sensation, and the third one is perception, and the final one is memory. So it is our social and cultural environment like home and school that allows us to use these skills to develop and finally gain mental function. He further states that it is precisely during early school age that the higher intellectual function, whose main features are reflective awareness and deliberate control, come to the fore in the developmental process. Attention, previously involuntary, becomes voluntary and increasingly dependent on the child's own thinking. Mechanical memory, which was monotonous, changes to logical memory guided by meaning and can now be deliberately used by the individual child. Therefore, the control or executive functions in terms of language becomes more and one's conscious product and not just imitation or empty verbalization like a parrot speech. When they are children, they just imitate. As they grow, they start speaking on their own. Furthermore, advanced concept presupposes more than just simple unification of words. To form such understanding about language concept, it is also necessary that child's thinking has to be developed in terms of functions like generalization and abstraction. The greatest difficulty of all is the application of concepts, finally grasped and formulated at the abstract level, to new concrete situations that must be viewed in these abstract terms, which Chomsky calls creative aspect of child. As I am preparing for this presentation, my 8-year-old son was learning to read, to pronounce, as well as to learn spelling in English. I was observing him learning from my father. He finds it difficult to read a new word and to pronounce it. This is simply because the words are abstract. Further, he finds it challenging to combine letters into a meaningful word and read, that is, making phonemes, as it has not been taught in school because of the coronavirus lockdown. This reduced the speed of internalization. So, generalization and abstraction in language requires a lot of exposure in the form of MKO and scaffolding. Another classic example being when my daughter was 4 years old, she started telling stories on her own, purely by observing and interacting with his elder brother. Here my daughter starts to relate abstract objects and try to think them in a continuum, and she managed it to a greater extent. But my son was not narrating stories when he was 4 years. This clearly shows generalization and abstraction in language is also added by social interaction. In other words, social interaction aids in generalization and abstraction abilities in children. From the above example, we can see how language development is more complex than just the sum of certain associate bonds formed by memory or mental habits spread over the growth and development of children. It is a complex and genuine act of thought that cannot be taught by pure drilling alone, but can be accomplished only when the child's mental development itself has reached the requisite level, feels the Russian psychologist. He further asserts that reaching the requisite level is purely based on the child's socio-cultural and language environment, which is a marked difference to what Piaget's stages of language development. As the child grows, development of concepts or words meaning for young children presupposes the development of many intellectual functions like deliberate attention, logical memory, abstraction, the ability to compare and to differentiate. In other words, the child develops greater command over language before focusing on abstract concepts in science and social science. Just imagine if one doesn't have understanding of English language, they cannot follow science when taught by the teacher in English. But these complex psychological processes of language development cannot be mastered through initial learning alone, which is the child's initial vocabulary strength, and eventually through systematic training and instruction involving tools which allows the child to use mental functions more effectively within the socio-cultural environment, which aids in developing into more sophisticated and effective mental processes or strategies referred to as higher mental functions. In other words, as the child grows old, cognitive functions carried out even when he is alone will still be affected by the beliefs, values, and tools of intellectual adaptation of the culture in which a person develops and therefore socio-culturally determined. The way one dresses or talks, the accents which we carry or use is heavily influenced by the culture or the society. The way we approach, think, gender stereotypes, and in terms of the tools of intellectual adaptation like family systems, family structure, religion, technology, all vary from culture to culture. He also emphasizes that when a child's learning environment is vibrant and rich, will certainly reflect in child's language abilities and cognitive processes. It is common experience that for an Indian child who is groomed from a family speaking in English at home, the communicative abilities in English is far better than a child whose language and communication at home is not English. According to Vygotsky, much important learning by the child occurs through social interaction with a skillful tutor. He believes scaffolding stimulates the intellectual curiosity of the child, and he emphasizes the importance of more knowledgeable others in stimulating mental functions. Their presence will enhance easy and quick learning. Now let us look into the major concepts introduced by Vygotsky on language development. The more knowledgeable others is somewhat self-explanatory. It refers to someone who has a better understanding or higher ability level than the learner with respect to a particular task or process or concepts. It can be in the form of parents, teachers, fellow students, or technology gadgets like Google Map and many more. The primary important principles for enhancing language development among children, according to Vygotsky, is zone of proximal development, which is integrally related to more knowledgeable others. It is also known as ZPD, relates to the difference between what the child can achieve independently and what a child can achieve with guidance and encouragement from a skillful partner. And this development ideally happens in the zone of proximal development. First, there is what we can do on our own. Then we start trying out things with the support from the environment, and Vygotsky calls this as ZPD. And then we will be able to do things which is beyond our reach. Vygotsky believes only those learning which is with the assistance of a capable mentor can reach the full potential of their ability. For example, even if the child is good in a particular aspect, they need teachers or coaches or expert guidance to realize the full potential well within their reach or comfort zone. Here it is, set PD. Another important factor he highlights here is that inside the zone of proximal development, learning can proceed to development, which means the child can develop skills that go beyond the child's natural ability. For example, if a child is provided with suitable exposure to a particular language, the development of skills in that language will even surprise the child. Wow, did I do that? Like experience, like feelings. The next thing he talks about is inner speech. Inner speech is not the interior aspect of external speech. It is a function in itself. It still remains speech, that is, thoughts connected with words. This internal speech, a monologue you hear inside your head, is a ubiquitous which we hear in the absence of actual sound and is largely an unexplained phenomenon. But while in the external speech, thought is embodied in words, in inner speech, words die as they bring forth thought. In inner speech, it is a large extent thinking in pure meaning. In his book on thought and language, he establishes the explicit and profound connection between speech, both silent inner speech and oral language. Vygotsky describes inner speech as being qualitatively different from verbal external speech or social speech. Although Vygotsky believed inner speech developed from external speech via a gradual process of internalization, with younger children who don't finish this process can only really be able to think out loud. He claimed that in its mature form, inner speech would not resemble spoken language as we know it, in particular being greatly compressed or suppressed. Thoughts are primitive while external speech or social speech is more socially civilized. Furthermore, Vygotsky was the first psychologist to document the importance of private speech. He considered private speech as a transition point between social and inner speech, the moment in development where language and thought unite to constitute verbal thinking. Thus, private speech, in Vygotsky's view, was the earliest manifestation of inner speech. Indeed, private speech is more similar in its form and function to inner speech than normal social speech. Private speech is typically defined in contrast to social speech as a speech addressed to self, not to others, for the purpose of self-regulation rather than communication. Unlike inner speech, which is covert or hidden, private speech is overt. In contrast to Piaget's notion of private speech representing a developmental dead end, Vygotsky viewed private speech as a revolution in development which is triggered when pre-verbal thoughts and pre-intellectual language comes together to create fundamentally new forms of mental functioning. Vygotsky sees private speech as a means for children to plan activities and strategize and therefore aid their development. It acts as a tool by the growing child to facilitate cognitive process such as overcoming tasks, obstacles, enhancing imagination, thinking, and conscious awareness. Language is therefore an accelerator to thinking or understanding. Jerome Bruner also views language in this way. Vygotsky proposed that private speech is a product of individual social environment, and children who are engaged in large amounts of private speech are more socially competent than children who do not use it extensively. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that there exists high positive correlation between the rates of social interaction and private speech in children. Now let us look into the key takeaways of Vygotsky's theory. The work of Vygotsky has become the foundation of much research and theory in cognitive and language development over the past several decades, particularly of what has become known as social development theory. Vygotsky states cognitive and language development stems from social interaction formed through guided learning within the zone of proximal development as children and their partners co-construct knowledge. As he places more emphasis on culture affecting learning and assumes cognitive development varies across culture, his assertion that environment in which the child grows up will influence how they think and what they think about and help in language development skills. Concepts like MKO, ZPD, inner speech, private speech, scaffolding have revolutionized the understanding of language development in children. Hope you found few interesting insights into Vygotsky's theory and process of language development. Do you feel private speech helps in socialization? Or how relevant are the thoughts of Vygotsky on language development today? Share your thoughts